Welcome back. In this video for Chapter 19, we are going to sort of use our Mundell-Fleming model that we started to develop in the last chapter and sort of show how we can look at it graphically and think about things like monetary policy and fiscal policy. And then we'll use it to show, what happened in the early 1980s in the United States when we had a monetary contraction, right? The Federal Reserve was trying to get rid of the high inflation that the economy was experiencing in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and a government contraction, no, excuse me, a government expansion that was caused by the increase in government spending and the decrease in government revenue from the tax cuts of the early 1980s. And as we'll see, it leads to an appreciation of the exchange rate and, not surprisingly, an increase in the trade deficit. So the first thing we want to look at is how are we going to sort of add in the exchange rate into our model. And so this is where we ended the last video, where we have the exchange rate increasing with the domestic interest rate, right? And obviously it will increase with the increase in the expected future exchange rate and decrease with the foreign interest rate. But our main focus here is going to be the domestic interest rate, because that is what is on the vertical axis of our ISLM model, right? And so we can graph this just with the exchange rate on the horizontal axis and the domestic interest rate on the vertical axis. And a higher domestic interest rate leads to a higher exchange rate, right? And this is for any given value of the foreign interest rate and the expected future exchange rate. I think this asterisk is an error, right? We used to put the stars there for the sort of equilibrium value, but now we have the stars for the foreign value, so we shouldn't have a star there. But basically what this is saying is that when the Federal Reserve increases the interest rate, that is also going to increase the exchange rate as long as everything else stays the same. And when the Federal Reserve decreases the interest rate, that is going to decrease the exchange rate. And so that's going to be the key piece in our Mundell-Fleming model. So now we have our IS curve, right, which we developed in Chapter 18. We reviewed in the first video for Chapter 19. And the key here, of course, is that this nominal exchange rate is going to be important. And so we've basically substituted in our equation for the nominal exchange rate, 1 plus the domestic interest rate divided by 1 plus the foreign interest rate times the future expected exchange rate. And then our LM model is the same, right? Because the LM model is just dependent on what the Federal Reserve is going to do with the policy rate. And so now, though, the Federal Reserve, instead of being in a closed economy where they only sort of directly impact investment, now they have to think about the impact on both investment and net exports. Fortunately, again, they are going to have the same effect, but it will make monetary policy somewhat more powerful. That said, of course, a lot of it depends on the foreign interest rate, right? If all the other central banks around the world decrease, interest rates at the same time the Federal Reserve does, or increase interest rates at the same time the Federal Reserve does, then this ratio will stay the same, and we wouldn't expect a huge change in our net exports. So here's the way we graph it. We graph it with two graphs side by side, and we have our standard ISLM model on the left-hand side in panel A. We've got output on the horizontal axis. We've got the domestic interest rate on the vertical axis. And then we have our interest parity relation on panel B on the right-hand side, where we have the exchange rate on the horizontal axis and the domestic interest rate on the vertical axis. And so we have them side by side because now our vertical axes are lined up. And so an increase in the interest rate reduces output both directly and indirectly, right? So we have a higher interest rate reduces investment, right? So we move up the IS curve, but it also will increase the exchange rate, which will reduce net exports, right? So imports will go up and exports will go down. So the good thing is that it moves them in the same direction, right? So we can be more confident in our answer in terms of, what will be the effect of a change in the interest rates. So let's look at a couple of examples here, first in the model, and then we'll look at the United States in the early 1980s to see how well the model predicts. So first we're going to look at a monetary contraction, right? So an increase in the policy rate. So if we start here at A and the Federal Reserve increases the interest rate from I to I prime, we move up the IS curve to our new equilibrium, A prime. We have a higher interest rate and lower output, right? This is exactly the same as in a closed economy. But the other thing that happens is that the higher interest rate, assuming that the foreign interest rate stays the same, increases the exchange rate, right? And so we move from E to E prime. And we know that an increase in the exchange rate will lead to a reduction in net exports. And so a stronger dollar, that's what a higher E means, will result in higher imports and lower exports, and therefore a higher trade deficit. Okay, so that's on the monetary side. Now, obviously, we could do the opposite too, right, with a monetary expansion, and we should have the opposite effect. On the fiscal side, we're going to look at a fiscal expansion, right? So this is an increase in government spending and or a decrease in taxes. And we're going to assume, at least in this case, that the Federal Reserve keeps the interest rate constant. So if we increase government spending, then output increases, right? So we go from our equilibrium of A to A prime with a shift in the IS curve to the right. Output increases from Y to Y prime. And now as long as the interest rate stays the same, we will have no change in the exchange rate. But we know that a higher GDP, right, will increase imports, have no effect on exports, assuming that the exchange rate is the same. And so, again, net exports will actually decrease. The trade deficit will increase. So if we combine these two policies, a monetary contraction and a fiscal expansion, what do we expect to see? Well, the result on domestic output is ambiguous, right? Because the fiscal contraction should decrease domestic output. The monetary contraction should decrease output. The fiscal expansion should increase output. But we should see higher interest rates, a stronger dollar, higher exchange rates, and an increasing trade deficit. And of course, we should also see a higher budget deficit because of the increase in government spending and or decrease in taxes. So this is exactly what we saw in the early 1980s in the United States. And so, when we had the sort of conservative revolution in the late 1970s and Reagan came into the White House, the argument was that a decrease in tax cuts would spur economic activity and would actually lead to an increase in tax revenues. This did not, in fact, happen. So as you can see, tax revenues were 20.8% of GDP in 1981, and they had fallen to 19.2% by 1984. And at the same time, we had been increasing government spending. This was sort of the height of the Cold War. So military spending was high. We had, had gone up to 25% by 1983 before coming back down a bit in 1984. But the combination of higher spending and decreased tax revenues is, of course, a fiscal expansion, shifting our IS curve to the right and leading to, a budget deficit, right? And so you can see our budget deficit was 5.6% of GDP in 1983 and 4.5% of GDP in 1984. Now, at the same time, of course, we had this really high inflation coming out of the 1970s, and the Federal Reserve was, really trying to get rid of that. And they had done this by increasing the policy rate, the federal funds rate, substantially. And in order to reduce inflation, right? So inflation, which was 12.5% in 1980, had come down to 3.9% by 1984. We had this recession, right? That, with a high unemployment rate of 9.7% in 1982, that, we're starting to recover from in 1984. Interest rates were really high, right? So that's our shift up in the LM curve. So what happened? We saw an appreciation in both the nominal and the real exchange rate. And so the real exchange rate went from 85 in 1980 up to 129 in 1984. And not surprisingly, as the model would predict, the trade deficit increased, right? So the trade deficit was pretty small in the early 1980s, 0.4 to 0.5% of GDP, and was up to 2.7% of GDP by 1984. So, the good news for the domestic economy was that GDP growth had really recovered by 1984, that the unemployment rate was coming down, inflation was low, but at the same time, we had these twin deficits, right? And these twin deficits were the budget deficit, because of the increase in spending and the decrease in taxes, and the trade deficit. And they were, very well predicted by the Mundell-Fleming model.